All right, welcome to the State of Innovation Challenge Industry Engagement. As I said, I'm Julia Reed. I'm part of the Challenge project team, and we're really excited to be joined today by Ashley Blazina from the Department of Natural Resources. Thanks for being here, Ashley.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
So tell me a little bit about, for all the folks that are watching, like what is your role at well, first of all, what is the Department of Natural Resources and what is your role there?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll share my screen just to give you guys a little bit more visual, because that makes it a little bit easier to share. Can you guys all see that?
Yeah,
PowerPoint?
coming.
Okay, great. I'll start at the beginning. Yeah. So my official title is Community Wildfire Preparedness Coordinator. Department of Natural Resources, a lot of people know it as kind of the agency in the state that controls a lot of the timber management of our state. That was originally what it was really created for. But we're also a big component of wildfire control suppression in our state. Those are just two prongs of DNR. We do a lot more. The background picture I chose showed water because we do a lot with aquatics. I'm actually part of the forest health division. And so what we do, this picture is me and two of my coworkers, Ken, who's a wildlife biologist, and Matt, who is a forest or stewardship forester. But a lot of time we're going out and talking with different folks throughout the state. Almost all of us in our division serve across the state. Just seeing what people need in their community for our particular areas of expertise. So in my realm, I'm looking at how different communities, how different individuals, households, what the relationship with fire really is and how we can make it more resilient, because as everyone knows, conditions are getting hotter and drier across the state. And so we really need to make sure that everyone is as prepared as possible, but also learning different ways that our ecosystems that we all live in can be more resilient as well.
That's awesome. And I think a lot of people don't realize, like, there's so much forest land in our state. There's state forests, there's national forests, there's a lot of natural space in our state. I mean, I live in a big city, so I don't see it all the time, but it's all around us, and you know, all of our water, all the water that we drink in our cities comes from these watersheds that are in forested areas. I think a lot of people don't realize, like, there's just how critical these spaces are.
Right. Yeah, and that's another big part of DNR is just making sure that we're really coordinating between different agencies. So here's a shot of folks from Department of Natural Resources, but also from Fish and Wildlife and from a local conservation district. A lot of conservation districts work more on the ground, more locally with a lot more community members. And so this is us doing a field tour, just really trying to make sure that we're coordinating our work and working in conjunction with each other, cooperating, really coordinating that, because there is a lot of times opportunities for communication to not occur and for people to be working simultaneously on projects that could be complementary, but we all are very limited in our resources in terms of how much staff time we have, what our budgets are. And so this really maximizes it through that cooperation.
Yeah. So really making sure that, like, state, local, conservation district, all the different levels of kind of government and people are working together and sort of know what each other is doing is really important.
Yes. Oh man, key. Yeah.
Sometimes the hardest thing to know is what all the different pieces of the system are doing at any given time, especially, I bet, in emergency situations, like when you're dealing with wildfires and kind of fast moving issues.
Yeah, that's very true. That's something that I think it really came to fruition, just that coordination between different agencies in the 1980s, which is a lot later than a lot of people realize, just in terms of that coordination. But it's something that is also carried over into some other coordination too. So a lot of good opportunities for crossover in terms of lessons learned from different aspects of natural resources.
Awesome. Well, let's talk about that kind of crossover and pathways. Like, how did you get into this position? How do people come to work in these jobs?
Yeah. So my path was a little bit different, I guess. I've always kind of gone between a few different Well, I guess it's been mainly natural resource positions, but then also I did a lot of writing and editing throughout the last 14 years of my adult life, I guess. So yeah, I would say that when I was for most of my childhood, I thought I was going to be a writer. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to write children's books, actually, and realized when I got to college that I really liked hearing people's stories more than making up those stories. And so I got into doing a lot more journalism, just realizing the importance of stories. But then another thing that I realized in college was just how much I enjoyed the woods. We did not have a lot when I was a kid, and so a lot of times we did camping because that was a cheap vacation. And so the woods really became this area that was kind of like my church, I would say, in terms of where I really like to be. And so I found that I really wanted to have that as the environment where I worked. And when I realized I took a geology class in college that I could do this, I could work in this environment, that really became a focus of mine too. And so I also kind of toggled between some different positions within natural resources. So starting out just doing field assistant work, a lot of times it was on a volunteer basis, helping out with habitat projects, ecological restoration projects, and then eventually working my way up to a research scientist. Yeah, the reason I work for DNR is because the academic route, while I liked it, I realized that a lot of times it was a little bit more separate from the needs of the community at large. So when it was actually applied in the areas and for the communities it was serving, it was missing some components. It was missing, it was missing those stories that that the community members had, and that really needed to be part of it. And so that's really how I kind of combined the two, was the fact that these stories, these different viewpoints, the standpoints of different community members, that was really important to bring into this work. And so I think both prongs of my background were really important. One thing I did want to share, though, is that a lot of times during all of these different internships and volunteer positions, I was also making a lot of cups of coffee. So I was a barista most of the time. And I just want everyone to know that if you find that a lot of times you're still doing, the vast majority of your working life is doing something in retail or barista or bartending or wherever it might be, and I did lifeguarding, that's normal, and that's part of the journey, is that why you might put the volunteer positions on your resume, a lot of times this is running in the background to just keep you going. So
I love that. It's, it takes lots of jobs to get to, to your passion, like you said, to support yourself while you're in school, and to kind of, and even just to start to know like what you like to do. I bet as a barista, you get a lot of good people stories to tell. And if that's a passion of yours, I can see how that contributes to your overall goal. And I'd love to just kind of tease that out a little bit more about your interest in stories. Because I think, when people think about like careers in resource management or working in forestry, or working in ecology, they think about like, oh, I have to be good at science, I have to be really good at biology, and like those are the most important courses. But it sounds kind of like your English courses, your communication courses might be just as important to the job that you do now. Would you say that that's true?
Oh, yeah, I would say that the fact that I do have that background has been so key. So there's a lot of folks who did kind of just focus on the science aspect. And I would say that my role is relatively unique. So this is an org chart of everyone that is in my division, but a lot of folks, and this is a smaller picture, but there's only, I would say, 3 positions in this entire network of different positions that have that outreach engagement component. And a lot of times we're really called up by all of our other colleagues to give them some insight into how communities are thinking about things, what they're talking about. And so being able to communicate with people is so key, because in any science needs to be applied. And for it to work, for it to be effective, you can't just have the results of a study. You need that human component, because all of this is for people in our environments too.
Absolutely. It's really the stories that you tell that are most moving to people. I think I remember that from work, that you can give people a ton of statistics and information, and it doesn't influence them as much as, one really well told story that feels relevant to them.
Yes. Oh man. Yeah. Yeah. And that's it. It's like, even thinking about this PowerPoint, I was trying to figure out, okay, well, what's really going to help tell this story? And it's so difficult to tell a well-crafted story. So being able to do that skill set will take you in so many directions if you want to. Yeah.
Awesome. I just want to shout out for our watchers. If you have questions for Ashley that you'd love to ask, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll be happy to kind of offer them up to her as we're going along. So if there's anything you don't understand or want clarified, or just questions that you have about this work, go ahead and shout it out in the chat. Ashley, speaking of, telling stories, I'd love to kind of know more about this topic, kind of the life and role that you've had during the pandemic, because this was both 2020 was a crazy year in terms of the pandemic, but it was also a really crazy fire season. So what has your life been like over the last 9 months?
Oh man, it's been super different. So usually my life prior to this was, I was working in different communities. I was driving at least 1 or 2 days a week, going to different communities and working with them either on plans. So like, here's a map from a community meeting where we're looking at where some fires were and where some of those risk factors might be, and then getting their input. There's another picture from a survey that we did just at a certain rest stop to see. We wanted people's input in terms of what their thoughts were on wildfire awareness, what things they were still unsure about. So really trying to target that. Nowadays, it's a lot more of this. And I chose this particular picture for a few different reasons. I know my face is not very attractive, but I feel like everyone has a little bit of this. At this point is the Zoom fatigue.
Those awkward Zoom photos.
Right. But a lot of it is these Zoom meetings. And so it's been a lot more online workshops. We've made videos for folks, had panel discussions, but that doesn't meet everyone. And so one of the things that's really come to light is just the number of inequities and how much they've been exacerbated in our work. You can drive to a lot of those communities, but a lot of times those communities don't necessarily have reliable access to internet, or it's too expensive to have all the time. And so when they do have it available, or when they do have the opportunity to pay for it, it really has to be a priority. And so a Zoom workshop is usually not going to be that high up there. And so meeting those needs has been a really big challenge. And it's something that I think what we've really tried to focus on is planning to make sure that we're as effective as possible when we can go back and actually meet those communities where they're at in their communities, because there's nothing that really replaces that, is going to a community and listening to them. I would say that's the biggest part of my job, is really being able to really listen, not come with a lot of assumptions, but being able to listen to what their needs really are, regardless of whether it's related to wildfire or not. There's ways that it can be, we can meet it, and we can work together with different partners to help. But yeah, so it's been a lot of planning. So this is a map that we've been looking at a lot of historic wildfire regime, and then some of the changes with wildland urban interface, and really thinking about, well, where are those areas where it's really changed a lot? Where are the areas we really need to target more? Looking at other maps of access to things like vehicles in communities, what's the percentage of that particular community that has access to a reliable vehicle? What's the percentage of that community that is English as a second language? What percentage has a population that has additional needs, whether that be they be children, elderly, additional potential disabilities that need additional consideration. So it's been a lot more planning. Then in some cases, also trying to get together groups through these Zoom meetings to see about partnerships and putting some of that work on the ground when we do get to go back into life in person. And so this is one particular multi-pronged partnership that was great, and we're really hoping it gets funded. This for a particular grant, but it had Western Washington, it had Samish Indian Nation, the local conservation district, and some of the preservation trusts, and as well as state parks and a local consulting firm. And so I would say it's a lot more kind of calling rather than going out and meeting these communities, relying on those past relationships. But there's still a lot of people that need to be met and still haven't had as much access as they should to some of these services that we provide. So yeah, it's been a lot more planning, a lot more Zoom meetings, and really trying to make sure we're in as good of a place as we can when we can fully go out or go back into these communities again.
Yeah. Well, and that planning, those discussions that you have that you're trying to figure out about, do people have vehicles? Do they speak other languages? That's really all about understanding how to help the community be prepared for fire season. Like if they have to evacuate quickly, so that kind of, okay, the people in this community speak Spanish or Amharic, and they need flyers and information in that language if we're going to help them know that when it's time to go. So is that sort of what you mean by that planning?
Yeah, I would say that's one aspect of it. And here, let me go to one more. This is a chart that I look at a lot in terms of what are some of the aspects of fire adaptation, fire resiliency that I'm routinely missing. I'm not an expert in all of these different areas, so I rely on partners a lot. But yeah, that safety and evacuation, I don't know if you guys can see my mouth, but that's a big one. When talking about like vehicles or primary language spoken at home, what sort of communication materials do we need? That also goes hand in hand with community engagement work. But other ways we're thinking about it are like landscape treatment. So going back to some of those partnerships, thinking about, do they know where there's been past work done to help with wildfire resiliency? What are the areas that really have those higher wildfire risks? But then in other cases, it's looking at things like public health. What is the smoke preparedness? Even if the community isn't necessarily affected directly by wildfire, there's a lot of members of that community who might be really affected by smoke. And right. So what are some things that they have available or aren't available that really could be really beneficial in any wildfire season? Things like business resiliency. After a wildfire occurs, do these businesses have an ability, especially the smaller businesses, to recover? What are their plans? What are some potential options for making sure that long-term recovery is going to be effective? And so in that case, that's usually talking with community members who have already been through wildfire and really trying to learn from them. What are some of the things that took the longest to recover from? What are the things that they didn't necessarily plan for? So yeah, that's just kind of a smattering of the different things that I have a big version of this in my office, and I have one now that I look at a lot at home, but it's something I always refer back to. It's like, what are the pieces I'm missing? What are the things I need to be thinking more about?
Yeah. So the goal is to really try to get all communities in the state to be these kind of fire adapted communities
Yeah.
to have a plan for safety and evacuation, for you at DNR to kind of listen to them about what they know about their own fire risk, their own landscape, and for them to have plans for kind of public health and business response. I think that's really great. I think, we often, I know just from a public health perspective, living in a city that's impacted by smoke, you often wait until the smoke arrives before you start to think
Right.
about this. And by then it's too late. And similarly, if you wait for the fire, it can be too late to put these plans in place. But I'm curious, I want to kind of touch on that too, because I know this was a particularly bad season, and you mentioned that a lot of communities in Washington State, I think almost all communities, are impacted in some way by wildfires. Yeah. Are you seeing, is that sort of a trend that you're starting to see, kind of increased, like hotter, bigger fires, longer fire seasons? And are people living closer to fires now? Is it like, what are some of the reasons behind that kind of increased fire threat, or what I guess is your hypothesis as a scientist about some of the thoughts about why we're being impacted by this so much more?
Yeah, I think it's a few different factors. So one of the reasons it was such a bad fire season this year is partially due to COVID, and that's because a lot of the wildland fire training academies didn't occur, and so a lot of those new wildland firefighters weren't trained, and so it was just forces from previous years. So they got maxed out really quickly. So like when we had the Sumner grade fire in Pierce County, a lot of the firefighters had already gone east of the Cascades, and so there wasn't as many folks able to put that fire out as quickly. And so that was one of the issues there with that fire. It also was exacerbated just because it's been a drier year. Conditions are hotter than they were previously, and so it's a lot easier for those fires to start. And that's something that a lot of folks don't necessarily realize, is how quickly the conditions can change. So in Western Washington and Western Oregon, about 90% of our fires are started by people. And so we really have an option to prevent a lot of these, but a lot of times they're accidental too. And so in a lot of cases, our fire investigators, when they go out, they see that it was something like someone was burning some of their brush after they did a backyard project. Like a lot of people did a lot of backyard projects this past year due to COVID, just being at home. And there's a lot more of those spot fires. One of the other reasons that we're seeing a lot more is that there's a lot more people that are moving in to Washington. So I'll go back to that map. So the wildland urban interface is how we define it in Washington are those areas where wildlands are meeting the structures that humans have built. And so the red are really those areas usually along the borders of more urban areas. And so that makes sense. We see kind of that Everett to Tacoma corridor. But then the orange is really those areas where the houses are starting to spread into those wildlands. And so we're seeing a lot more people move into those areas that have that denser forest, but also grassland, shrub, woodlands. And so all of those can create a forest fire, a wildfire. And so I think people moving into those environments who aren't necessarily aware of what some of those risk factors are. So they might start a burn pile closer than they should to some of those woods, or they might light off fireworks closer to the woods than they thought woods would start a fire. And so there's and people who are moving from other environments where maybe there wasn't wildfire at all. So people moving out from outside of Washington to our state. That can also go the other way, though. A lot of folks who are moving up from California come in, give me a call or an email and say, we need to solve this right now. This is gonna, we're all gonna die in my community. And so it can go either way, which is great, because that's something that is constantly changing in every community too, is kind of that the culture of what role and how big of a role wildfire plays in that community, and how they're preparing, and what they're thinking about, what the weights are. So I would say those are some of the biggest factors, is just the ever-changing kind of knowledge base of what people know about wildfire and what's really most important to them. The variety of spaces that people are moving into where there wasn't necessarily a structure before, and just the changing conditions, and those variety of different wildfires too. So it's a lot of different things.
We had a question from the audience about, does DNR ever like talk to developers about places that they advise not building because of the wildfire risk? Is that kind of part of the outreach efforts?
Yeah, that's been something that is actually goes hand in hand with this wildland urban interface map, actually. So this map, you guys are getting a sneak peek at it, but this is something that's going to be published later this month, and this is something that actually, once this is published, 4 new things are added to our building codes in terms of what is required in terms of fire resistant, non-combustible materials when folks are building new houses or renovating existing houses in these areas. But yeah, I would say there's definitely some pushback between developers and planners too, just because a lot of times some of these materials that are more fire resistant, they cost more, and so that can bring up their costs. And so it's trying to find ways that make sense for everybody, and thinking about overarching costs over time. But yeah, we actually just had, me and the Wildfire Resiliency Coordinator for King County just had a conversation with the land developer, with the land planner, about how to be more effective in bringing this, because we've talked with like the Association of Planners about this, but that's definitely something I think a lot of planners and developers aren't as aware of, and so something that we need more of. In Colorado, for example, they've done a lot, and this is a little bit of a different prong, but touches more with real estate agents, where they will actually have that work with them to have a house be, I don't think it's a official certification, but deemed more fire safe, more fire resilient. And so it will go through these different checklists of, it has a fire resistant roof, and the landscaping is more fire resistant. It's plants that are more fire resistant around it. So there's a lot of different things, opportunities that we can still, and different practices that we can really install in Washington. And that's something too, is just learning from different states, what they've done, what's been successful. That's really helpful too. So listening to their challenges, lessons learned, and successes.
Awesome.
But great question.
Yeah. And then another question also from Stephanie. So you guys, you also track this wildland urban interface for the whole state, right? I mean, I know this section just looks at Western Washington, the peninsula, but I see the Tri-Cities there off on the right-hand side.
Yeah. And I could share the whole map if that would be helpful, but yeah.
Why don't we, let's plan to put it on we'll touch base after, and we can put it up on our website as a resource if folks want to download it, and share with their classes what that looks like. And speaking of our website, maybe this would be a good opportunity to just kind of transition to the challenge case. So we invited Ashley to be here. You'll also see her featured in in some of our other content on the site, but we wanted to talk about a little bit about the challenge case that we propose to students. The one that I think is most relevant to what DNR does is our communities after COVID-19, and thinking about how we create more resilient, healthier communities in the wake of the pandemic. And one of those questions is really focused on wildfire response, and what are students' ideas for kind of designing communities that are more resilient from fires. I know I had family members that were affected by the Paradise, California fire, and one of the things I read about was just the the design of the town and how that created a bottleneck for evacuation. But there's lots of other things. We talked to Jason Ramos, the wildland firefighter, about sort of what he sees from a firefighter perspective for community preparation. But what is your advice to young people who might be taking on that question, sort of how to design more resilient communities?
Yeah. In terms of how to design more resilient communities, I would say the first thing to do is really start with the home, the structures themselves. I think a lot of times we're thinking that we need to focus on kind of the forest and then work our way in. But honestly, a lot of times when fire starts, I think it's upwards of 80%. That figure changes depending on the year's totals. That statistic adjusts a little bit, but about 80% of homes are actually, when they do ignite, it's from embers. And so it's those tiny little bits of kind of the fingers of a wildfire that move into those new communities or new areas from a fire that might have started in the woods. And those embers can travel up to a mile. And so starting with the home is really key, because a lot of times homes are less fire resilient than the surrounding vegetation. The trees around your house have access to the water through their roots. Your house doesn't. And so making sure that a home is really fire resilient is going to be key. Then working your way out into the surrounding yard, landscaping, and making sure that you're choosing plants and breaking up. So choosing plants that are more fire resistant. And I can send you a great guide that goes through some of the most fire resistant plants in Washington for landscaping. There's a lot of really awesome options. But then also thinking about how you're breaking up those different types of vegetation. So a really big thing is making sure that you're separating vegetation both horizontally. So you're not necessarily having these huge hedges that just connect all the way across your yard. So you're having things like stone pavers or gravel or something that won't necessarily feed the flames in your yard, but then also vertically. So for those trees that have branches that go down to the ground, and a lot of trees in our state do self-prune, but there's some like lodgepole pine that have those branches all the way down to the ground, making sure that we're trimming them up. So we have that vertical lack of connectivity, but also the horizontal. And then, as you mentioned with Paradise, really thinking about evacuation. A lot of the new communities, and I left the wildland urban interface map up just because a lot of the new communities that we're seeing, that we're working in, that we're doing, and that's another part of my job, is doing assessments in these communities to see what those wildfire risks are. A lot of times one of the biggest things is that they only have one route out. And in some communities, what has actually happened is when people are leaving during a wildfire, they've actually they forget to turn the recirc for their air on in their car, and then that will cause the smoke to fill up their car. And so they abandon their car and then start walking on foot. This is only one example, but that blocks up that one way out. So it can happen very quickly. And so thinking creatively about different ways that your community could have these evacuation routes or different ways to get to safety. So there's one community that recently decided, hey, we only have one main road out, and so that could easily get blocked up. But we do know that we have this large field in the elementary school next to our community, and that could be a safety zone for us during a fire. Let's see about getting a trail so that at least some of our community members, and a lot of communities will kind of break up into zones. Let's make sure that some of our community members can use that trail and use that as their first safety zone. And then we move on from there, basically continuing on with the planning. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways to think creatively. Some other communities are thinking about ways they can connect to other local road networks. Yeah, I would say those are the three biggest things. And then it's really working out into the further woods and making sure that those are more fire resistant. But I will say that a lot of different folks are working on that right now too, are thinking about, well, how are we making our forests more healthy? How are we making them more sound for a lot of the different wildlife that we want to protect their habitats? And often those things go hand in hand, which is awesome. Sometimes they don't, but that's something that I would say, if you're focusing on the communities, focus on those three things: the home, really making sure those are as wildfire resistant as possible, that local landscaping, and then the evacuation routes planning.
That's awesome. I love that idea of starting from the house and then kind of working out into the broader community and kind of going on from there. And I mean, also, I think too, another thing I've heard too is thinking about, as you're going out into the broader community, you know, thinking about people who may be houseless, or as you said, Ashley, like people who have special needs, so people in wheelchairs or who have other access issues, thinking about them. That's why it sounds like this planning that DNR does is so important.
Yes, yeah, and that's another huge thing. And one I would also recommend, and I'll send a link about this as well, is the Map Your Neighborhood program. It was originally developed for earthquakes, but it's something that we've adopted a lot for wildfire. And that's something where you can really map out who are your neighbors. I know that I only know a few of my neighbors, but the Map Your Neighborhood program gives you a good opportunity to know what some of those special needs are. Maybe you have someone that lives 3 doors down who's deaf, and if there is an alert, they might not hear their phone, they might not hear it. And so having something as simple as everyone having a sheet that says okay or need help, and that's something you can get from the Map Your Neighborhood program. Really easy to print out. There's a lot of different resources. You don't need to officially be part of that program, but just having designated buddy, basically a neighborhood buddy who you're checking in with to making sure they're okay, and then you move on from there. Having phone trees, that's something that a lot of communities after this particular wildfire season realized, even the ones that had some plans, they realized we need to talk more about whose role is what, because they realized, well, we know where this evacuation route is, we know where we're supposed to be going, but we don't know who is going to tell us when to go there, or who is going to help this neighbor who has a wheelchair, or this family that's new to the area and maybe doesn't have those alerts yet. So yeah, there's a lot of different factors, and that's something that every community is different. Every community is changing. It's not just the physical factors of like topography of the area. Culture is always changing. The demographics of the community are usually changing or adjusting over time. So thinking about how to update those plans every few years too is really key.
Awesome. This is great. Well, it sounds like we'll have a lot of good resources to add to our site. I'm excited to get the Map Your Neighborhood program and things on there. We have you just for a couple more minutes. So I just want to remind folks, if there's any questions you wanted to get to, I see one here about wild foraging and harvesting. So I'll get to that in a second, but Ashley's got her info up here as well. If you want to reach out directly, or if any of your students have questions and they want to follow up, that is a great resource. So let me get to this question, Ashley, and then maybe we'll have one last Q, and we'll see if we get any other Q&A. Otherwise, I've got one last one to wrap up. But Stephanie wanted to know, does DNR collaborate with USDA? Do they look at food security or forest foraging or any kind of harvesting ethics? Does that fall under the kind of DNR umbrella?
I think I want a little more clarification, because there's a few different types of harvesting that could go on. So it could be timber harvesting with like the U.S. Forest Service, but it could also be traditional ceded territory for a lot of our indigenous and First Nation peoples. And so depending on what that question is oriented to, I can give you, well, I guess I'll just talk to both a little bit.
I think it's probably the latter. I think it's more about sort of food harvesting or food foraging as opposed to timber harvesting. Yeah.
So I'll say that I do have partnerships with some different tribes and indigenous peoples in the state but that's something that I feel like still needs to be strengthened quite a lot. So one of the projects I've been working on recently is the Shoalwater Bay tribe. They're actually moving their reservation up away from the coast because of climate change. And so they've really been thinking about, well, as we're moving upland and then inland, how can we still retain some of the sites that we're using for hunting, for harvesting, and make sure that those are still accessible while still having our reservation be wildfire resilient and still retain some of those habitats, those really important habitat for marbled murrelet down there, for example. And so thinking about all of those different components. Some spaces are fire adapted already. So like one project I'm working on is for traditional areas of camas harvest. Those are areas that had a lot of fire. Those were purposely burned and have been since time immemorial in a lot of spots in Western Washington, especially in the Puget Sound Valley. And so looking at what are those areas that are still accessible, but what are those areas that maybe need some additional work? So we're working on a mapping project on, and that's with a few different partners, so it's Forest Service, but also faculty from UW and Evergreen State College and a few other partners, EPA as well, who are really thinking about, well, how can we look at historic maps, but also some of those areas that we know do have that access now and making sure that there's still that access. And is there ways to also bring more fire to them today, since so much of that prescribed fire was suppressed for so long?
Yeah, when you say purposeful burn, it means that that's part of the like native land maintenance process about, you know, that a lot of, I think what we think about is like, oh, we want to not have fires, but, you know, native and indigenous tribes to this area have been using controlled burning to maintain land as part of their traditional practices, and since it's worked pretty well. And so trying to sort of help them kind of think about trying to help them be able to bring those back, because now you have, of course, indigenous communities and indigenous farm and fishing places side by side with kind of urban growth, and sort of how do you sort of create that space? Is that sort of what you're?
Yeah, and I bring back the map. So now I'm looking at the one that's on the left, but so this is historic wildfire regime, and the areas in purple and beige are the ones that had those more mixed severity, more frequent fires occurring. The areas in white are those areas that didn't have enough data, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their fire regime wasn't beige or purple. But this is, there are a lot of areas in Western Washington that regularly had those fires. You see a lot in Eastern Washington as well. That more infrequent burning that we've thought about for Western Washington or been told is not necessarily the case across the board. And so we really do live in a lot of areas that are fire adapted. I live in Tacoma currently, and it's an area that a lot of the spaces in Tacoma routinely had these fires. It's what the environment has evolved with, and that's in a large part that has been since these fires, this management of indigenous communities since time immemorial. So it's a huge part. It's a huge part of our fire adaptation bringing into the future too.
Awesome. Well, and one last question from our guests. So do you work with USDA or with farmers around kind of farmland exposure to forest fires, or when fires are burning in farmland? We've obviously a lot of agricultural territory in Washington. So
yes, yeah, that's kind of an interesting beast, because there's so many different types of farmland, and so a lot of times we're partnering with the conservation districts, because a lot of conservation districts were originally the soil and water conservation districts, and so working with a lot more of the farmland, the ag. When I lived in Illinois, I actually used to work for a conservation district, and we almost exclusively worked with farmers. But yeah, I mean, the different needs of the farmers and making that wildfire resiliency, a lot of times it's still making sure that they'll be able to have fields that are profitable. Thinking about where the wildfire buffers, that's a big thing in different more rural communities, I would say. But yeah, I think the thing that's the most interesting with a lot of the farmers is kind of listening to what their main concerns are, and how they overlap with other concerns. So like, I guess one of the things I'm thinking about right now is there's this partnership with the Arid Lands Initiative with the Audubon. So it's with folks that are more concerned with birds most of the time, you would think. But one of the things that they heard from a lot of these landowners that had habitat near really important bird habitat were farmers who were concerned about wildfire. And so there's a lot of different prongs and people who are working on those ag lands or areas near ag lands that are trying to make them more wildfire resilient for a lot of different cross purposes. Yeah, but with wildfire just being more frequent in Eastern Washington, where we do have a lot more of those agricultural lands, it's something that is still a big issue, and there's still a lot of nuances to it, just based on the bordering lands too, and how often they are burning, as well as the road networks near those ag lands, because a lot of times we find fires are started by chains on large vehicles along some of our main highways and freeways. And so also some of that education goes along with it. That isn't necessarily something that the farmers need to know about, but more how are we working with like Department of Transportation on making sure that we're really getting those messages out as early as possible in wildfire season.
Great, I love it. Well, Ashley, thank you so much for your time. This was so helpful. Again, if you have more questions for Ashley, we'll be happy to pass your contact information along. Don't forget to visit our website at innovationwa.org, and we'll post some of the resources that Ashley shared during this conversation there. You can also shoot us an email at stateofinnovationwa@gmail.com, and we'll be happy to pass any of those notes on to Ashley. So Ashley, thank you so much for your time. This was great.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Thank you everyone for watching, and we'll be back on Thursday with the Seattle Fire Department talking about their role in public health in COVID-19 testing and vaccinations. So more to come on that. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you all. It was great to be here.
Bye.
Bye.